let's give, let's just wait 2 minutes or so and see if we get more people here. Sorry, just. Sorry guys, give me 1 second. My allergies are acting up today and my nose is just running a lot. So.
Gotta beat the shit out of this fucking dude.
Yeah, I'm not.
All right, so I want to cover the lab on the endocrine system and then try to do a little bit more lecture and let's just see what happens. Where do they fall? There they are. Okay. Okay, so the endocrine system. Do you remember, and you gotta think back, but do you remember from last semester, what are the major differences between the nervous system and the endocrine system?
The endocrine, doesn't the nervous system activate the endocrine system hormones?
Not always. Not always. They work in conjunction with one another, but not always.
Endocrine secretes, right? Sorry.
Say it, go ahead, say it again.
I was saying, I think endocrine will be more in charge of like the secretion, and then the nervous system will be acting like sending message, and depending what area of the body or whatever, the right kind of like
Let
hormone.
me see, because I didn't include a figure here, but I'm gonna, here's one. Let's see here. I mean, sometimes, yes, the nervous system can activate the endocrine system, but the endocrine system is also capable of activating the nervous system. They work in conjunction with one another. Which one tends to secrete hormones?
Well, they both do.
They
Okay.
both do. They both do. Which one tends to secrete them into the blood?
Endocrine.
Endocrine.
The endocrine, right. Which one tends to act faster?
Nervous system.
The nervous system. Which one tends to act for the longer period of time?
Endocrine.
Endocrine.
It's the endocrine system, right. So you can tell there's some major differences, right? But they also are going to work in conjunction. They're both involved here. So here's one slide. And nervous system, electrical impulses are the messengers, but you do have neurotransmitters. A neurotransmitter can also be considered a hormone depending on what's using it and when. If you think about some of your, trying to think. When we run into them, I'll tell you. But right now, let's just say that you can use a hormone as a neurotransmitter. It depends on what's responding to that hormone. Whether you have a receptor for a neurotransmitter responding to a molecule, or whether you have a receptor for a hormone responding to a molecule. The receptor is what's going to make the difference in what happens when whatever molecule binds. Does that make sense? So hormones are the chemical messengers in the endocrine system, and they are secreted throughout the blood. The endocrine system tends to last a lot longer, its effects, because until the hormone is used up and gone, its effects will continue. If you remember with the neurotransmitter, their messengers, they diffuse across that synaptic cleft and then they're gone. And then they're either taken up or diffuse away, and they're in such small concentrations that they're not going to go very far. Or you use them and then they're gone. So they're fast because that diffusion doesn't take very long to move it across the synaptic cleft. But once you quit releasing the neurotransmitter, it's a matter of a few microseconds before it's over. Just for a second. So they work in conjunction with one another to coordinate the body's activities. So this is today's PowerPoint. There's also going to be 2 virtual labs. One that has to do with how thyroid hormone regulates temperature regulation and the effects of blood glucose levels on the endocrine system.
Bodhi.
So the endocrine system, major hormone functions. And if you think about this, a lot of these are the same functions as neurotransmitters, right? Synthesis of molecules within a cell, changing the plasma permeability. Well, how do you change the membrane potential? Change the plasma membrane permeability. Altering cellular metabolism, speeding up or slowing down the cell's functions. Similar to what we saw this morning with regards to how the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system increase or decrease the heart rate. Secretion of cellular products. Remember, certain neurotransmitters cause the release of other neurotransmitters. Contraction of smooth muscle. contraction of cardiac muscle. Remember these from the autonomic nervous system, how they're involved in this? So there's two basic types of hormones, and they're two separate classes based on their solubility. Hydrophilic hormones are peptides and amino acids. An example of a famous example, or the one we're most familiar with, are peptides, or catecholamines that are peptides, and hydrophobic hormones such as steroids. Hydrophilic hormones work through receptors on the cell surface because they can't go through the cell membrane. Remember how that membrane is selectively permeable? And things that are hydrophilic and large don't tend to go through it very easily. Hydrophobic steroids move easily through the plasma membrane. So hydrophilic tend to bind to a receptor, which starts a signaling cascade. Hydrophobic diffuse through the membrane, bind to a receptor within the cell, and then actually work on DNA to change gene expression. So hormones generally produce their effects by altering intracellular proteins. Hydrophilic hormones alter pre-existing proteins through second messenger systems like cyclic adenosine monophosphate or cyclic AMP. That's this right here. Or through altering calcium levels and or altering calcium levels. Lipophilic or hydrophobic, remember hydrophilic means that they're polar, right? Polar hormones. Remember how hydrophobic is non-polar, hydrophilic is polar? From last semester, like chapter 2, a really, really long time ago. Lipophilic, meaning that hydrophilic meaning water loving. Water is polar. Like dissolves like. Excuse me. So hydrophilic dissolve well in water, but they don't. Sorry, but they don't pass through the cell membranes, the plasma membranes. Their only choice is to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. And that receptor, when that ligand hormone binds, initiates a signaling cascade within the cell. Lipophilic or hydrophobic hormones are going to promote synthesis of new proteins by passing through the plasma membrane and binding to a receptor within the cell that then binds to the DNA and alters gene expression. And remember, when we talk about gene expression, we're specifically talking about decreasing or increasing the synthesis of new proteins. So 3 basic types of hormones. Peptides or polypeptides. They're hydrophilic, so they bind to receptors on the surface of the cell. Amino acids, another hydrophilic, bind to receptors on the surface of the cell. Steroids that are made from cholesterol, remember that cholesterol is a derivative for all steroids. It's a precursor molecule that produces all steroids, is lipid soluble and is going to bind to receptors inside the cell. So peptides, polypeptides. Peptides are hydrophilic, meaning they have to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell because they can't go through the lipids that make up the phospholipid bilayer. They're chains of specific amino acids. They're made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. We'll skip through that part. They're secreted from cells via exocytosis and transported in cells as free hormones because they're water soluble, so they dissolve right in the plasma. Their mechanism of action, they can create changes in channels in and out of the cell and activate second messenger systems to alter the activity of pre-existing proteins. Catecholamines are also hydrophilic. They're coming from amino acid derivatives. Hydrophilic, found in the cytosol, produced in the cytosol. They're released into the blood by exocytosis of granules. Their receptors are on the surface of target cells because they're hydrophilic. So they can only bind to the surface of the cell. They can't go through it. They work through activation of a second messenger system like cyclic AMP to alter the activity of pre-existing proteins. They are the only hormones that are going to come from the adrenal medulla. Remember where the adrenal glands are. They're right above the kidneys. Adrenal meaning right above the kidneys. Medulla meaning the inner part of the adrenal glands. Thyroid hormones, lipophilic. These require iodine. This is why you get iodized salt and why you need a certain amount of iodized salt, because that's one of the only ways that you get iodine in your diet. It's produced in a colloid in the thyroid gland. We'll talk about that in a moment here. It's secreted via endocytosis. And because it's lipophilic, the only way that it's going to move in the plasma is bound to plasma proteins. Its receptor is inside the target cell because it's lipophilic. It can go through the membrane. it allows for activation of specific genes to make new proteins. These are the only hormones from the thyroid follicular cells. Follicular coming from the word follicle. Steroids are also lipophilic, and remember their precursor molecule is cholesterol. We always talk about how cholesterol is bad for you. Well, you need a certain amount. You need a certain amount for making steroids, and you need a certain amount within the plasma membranes of your cells. Steroids are made through stepwise modifications of the cholesterol molecule. They're stored, the cholesterol molecule is stored in lipid droplets, and it's secreted through simple diffusion. It's lipophilic. Because it's lipophilic, the only way it's going to move in the plasma is when it's bound to plasma proteins. It also will pass through the plasma membrane because it's lipophilic. And it activates specific proteins, genes to produce new proteins. And steroids are hormones that are coming specifically from the adrenal cortex and the gonads. Guys, if you can memorize whether they're hydrophilic or lipophilic, and then whether they activate a receptor or they move into the cell, activate a receptor to start a second messenger, or bind to a receptor after they pass through the plasma membrane. And then where do they tend to be produced? That will speed up your whole adventure with learning the endocrine system. Because you're going to see when we cover it today, you'll see a little bit, but then when we cover it in lab, you'll see that there are a lot of different things to know here. So make your life a little easier by remembering this, making some connections in your head. If it's hydrophilic, it means that it's going to activate a receptor on the surface of the cell because it can't go through the cell. If it's lipophilic, it's going to move through the plasma membrane, before it actually activates anything. And it's going to work on gene expression. Hydrophilic are going to work on second messenger systems and amplification. So lipophilic hormones diffuse through the membrane. Remember, these are steroids and thyroid hormones. Diffuse through the membrane. Diffuse through the membrane. Bind to a receptor and move into the nucleus where they bind to the DNA. The DNA, the gene that's being actively expressed in response to this hormone is made into an mRNA that then leaves the cell. Remember this from almost what chapter was it? Chapter 3? Yeah, chapter 3 last semester. Moves out of the cell and is converted into a protein. So this is kind of, so I'm going to do a little bit of repetition here because you're going to learn really quickly that the endocrine system is a lot of information. So different steps with regards to lipophilic hormones. A lipophilic hormone diffuses through the plasma and the nuclear membranes of its target cell and binds to a nuclear receptor. Hormone binds to a nuclear receptor. The nuclear receptor complex in turn binds to a response element, part of the DNA segment, that is specific for the hormone receptor complex. The DNA, when it binds to the DNA, when the hormone bound to its receptor binds to the DNA, it activates specific genes which produce the complementary messenger RNA. The messenger RNA then leaves the nucleus. And in the cytoplasm, the messenger RNA directs the synthesis of new proteins. These new proteins either are enzymatic or structural and accomplish the cell's ultimate physiological response to whatever the hormone was. Questions? In contrast, hydrophilic hormones, they don't pass through the membrane. They can't pass through the plasma membrane. And so they're going to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. When it binds to a receptor on the surface of the cell, it's going to activate a G protein. That G protein is then going to activate adenyl cyclase, which converts ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP then activates a protein kinase A. Kinases, remember what they do? Do you remember what they do? Specifically, what do kinases do? Bear with me here. I don't know how much or how little we've talked about this. So kinases, first of all, if it ends in ASC, what does that mean?
Catalyzes.
If it
Like
ends in
catal-
A, it's an enzyme.
Yeah, and so it's an enzyme that catalyzes reactions. You are both right. So it's an enzyme that is going to add a phosphate group. Remember that phosphate functional group? It's going to add a phosphate group to a protein that adds phosphate group to a protein. And adding that phosphate group to a protein is capable. When you do that, you can turn on, you can increase the activity of a protein or decrease its activity. It's a switch. And depending on how that protein works, it will either increase the protein's activity or decrease it by adding that phosphate group. One more while we're at this. Well, I don't know how often we'll see it, but a phosphatase does the opposite. It's an enzyme that removes a phosphate group. From a protein. So coming back to our diagram here. The protein kinase A phosphorylates an inactive protein, activating it by adding a phosphate group to it. That protein then activates other things. Leading to the cellular response or the cellular function of that particular hormone. So lipophilic proteins are going to alter gene expression. So protein, AKA protein synthesis. Hydrophilic hormones are going to work through second messenger systems. I will tell you something, and then I won't go off on tangents. So I have 2 master's degrees, and I'll tell you why I have 2 masters, and then this doesn't leave our little area right here. The reason I have 2 master's degrees and not a PhD after being in school for almost 8 years for both of them. The first one was not knowing, because I had not had a physiology course, not knowing the insulin signaling pathway. And guess what? This is it. And that was why I failed my exams for my first doctorate, was because I didn't know this pathway. The reason I failed my second master's was for different reasons altogether. But this was my first one. It's a pretty uniform pathway. It works for all hydrophilic hormones. No, sorry, that makes me emotional when I think about that a little bit. Coming back to this amplification of this initial signal by a second messenger pathway. Extracellular chemical messenger. Anytime that you're working through a second messenger pathway, you're working with signal amplification. So the extracellular chemical messenger binds to a chemical receptor. It activates the adenyl-cyclase. Adenyl-cyclase makes cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP activates protein kinase. Protein kinase then activates other proteins by adding phosphate groups to them. Those proteins slash enzymes that you've activated by adding a phosphate group to them, then go on to create the products that are that they catalyze the reaction for. So you start with one signaling molecule. That signaling molecule activates like 10 adenyl cyclase enzymes. Those 10 adenyl cyclase enzymes then activate 1000 cyclic AMP. Those 1000 cyclic AMP then go on to activate 1000 activate 1000 protein kinase. Those 1000 protein kinase, once they're activated, can easily activate up to 100 other proteins, each one of them, resulting in 100,000 activated proteins. And then those go on to produce another 1,000 or something products per enzyme. Do you see how this is an amplification? One produces 10, 10 activate 1,000, 1,000 may activate 1,000 or more. These 1,000 activate 100 per each one of them. Each protein kinase activates 100. Each of the 100 activates another 100. Does this make sense? Is it clear? Because I can't see any faces now. Is it
Yes.
clear? Okay. So questions about how the different hydrophilic versus lipophilic proteins activate start things. Questions? So organ systems of the endocrine system. Do you remember the pineal gland from last semester? If you do, what does it produce?
Melatonin.
It produces melatonin. And what's the significance of the hypothalamus?
Doesn't it like retrieve all the information, like can tell you if you're thirsty, stuff like that?
It's your major, it's essentially the coordinator for homeostasis with regards to hormones and also the nervous system. Because it works through the pituitary gland. The thyroid gland produces your thyroid hormone, which has more targets than probably any other hormone you have when it comes to the things it affects. Parathyroid gland, what does the parathyroid gland do? What do you remember from last semester about the parathyroid gland?
Calcium uptake.
Calcium uptake, yep, it's involved in regulating calcium. I will tell you also that it's involved in, actually, I think it's the thyroid gland altogether. It's involved in metamorphosis. I learned this a really weird way. And the way I learned it is in one of my classes, in my second master's, one of my classes was we removed the thyroid gland from a bunch of little, bear with me, tadpoles. So we removed the thyroid gland from a bunch of little tadpoles and saw what happened. And you know, and I've told you, I'm a pretty big animal person. I like animals. I struggle with doing animal research because it's hard for me to do it. And I can't separate myself very well from what I'm doing. And so we removed the thyroid gland from these little tadpoles. We actually did anesthetize them, or we did put them under, and we did remove the thyroid gland. And we just kind of expected them to die. Well, most of them did die, except for one. And I am not, you know, I told you I'm an animal person. So what am I supposed to do with a little tadpole that's not dead? And this tadpole just gets bigger, but he's being a tadpole. He's not converting it, changing into a frog. Well, I wasn't really in a position to take a tadpole home, and I wasn't willing to, it was hard for me to even consider euthanizing it. How was I going to euthanize it? And so I had a student in one of my A&P classes that I told them about this little tadpole. And he said, do you care if I take it home? And I said, as long as we tell the school I flushed it down the toilet, you can take it home. You know, as long as nobody knows that it left the building, because you guys, Mary has never taken any animals out of the building in the school. You're not supposed to do that. I've never done that. We just flushed him down the toilet and he took him home. And a year later, he comes back and he says, Mary, that frog never turned into that tadpole never turned into a frog. He's still a tadpole. And come to find out, the thyroid gland is very important in metamorphosis. So the reason he never turned into a frog is because we removed the thyroid gland. I won't tell you about any other animals that I flushed down the toilet, but that one was one that I flushed down the toilet.
Is it still alive?
I don't know that, probably not, because this was easily, how long ago was it? 7-8 years ago. I don't know.
Did the tadpole like grow in size? It just didn't become a frog. I mean, was it like as big as a carp?
Well, it didn't get as big as a car or anything, but it did continue to grow in size. It just never became a frog.
Poor
Interesting.
guy.
I know. Poor tadpole.
Hey, but you know what? He survived the bunch of amateur surgeons trying to remove a thyroid gland on a tadpole. Imagine that one.
So he deserved to at least live a life as a tadpole.
Yes. I mean, and he named him Kermit and everything. I mean,
How do they even remove that? Like, how
Yeah.
do they do that?
well, we figured out anatomically where it was. And then we went in there and macerated it and cut it out.
Wow.
You gotta love being an amateur surgeon. And then we
Yeah,
stitched
it's
them up.
fascinating.
How long did it take?
Probably not more than a half hour.
For tadpole.
Yep.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, wow.
But I mean, you gotta love this amateur, you know, it's kind of like me dissecting the heart the couple weeks back. You know, we're not exactly great surgeons. So
Well, you got to start somewhere.
exactly.
Yeah.
Better there than on a human.
Exactly.
Mhm. I couldn't have done
Um,
it either, so it's, I don't know.
Say it again, Zena.
I said I couldn't have done it either on animal. That's just, I don't know.
It's not something I struggle with it. No, when I worked with baby chickens, they were so little that they didn't even realize I was there and that I was doing
Okay.
anything to them. And that's why it didn't bother me. But once they got to a certain age, I couldn't, I struggled really badly with doing anything with them. So thyroid gland, the thymus is involved in your immune system. Remember, this is your T cells. The adrenal gland, the pancreas, and the ovaries and the testes. One thing that's not included according to your book is the kidneys. But I would still consider the kidneys a gland of the endocrine system, because it does secrete a lot of hormones. So I'm not sure if I agree with the fact that your book says that it's not, but I have other books that say that it is. So hypothalamus, have the nuclei of the hypothalamus, which is connected to the anterior and posterior pituitary via the infundibulum. We'll see that in a minute, how that's spelled. But within this stalk is the infundibulum. Here's how you spell the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus, the infundibulum, posterior pituitary, also called the neurohypophysis, because it's actually secreting hormones via neurons moving into the posterior pituitary. That's where the name neurohypophysis comes from. So nuclei up here and right here are going to initiate the secretion of certain hormones that are actually made up here in the, so hormones that are made in the hypothalamus get stored in the posterior pituitary. And then when certain neurons activate parts of the posterior pituitary, it's going to release the two hormones that are stored here in the posterior pituitary that were made in the hypothalamus. The hormones that come from the anterior pituitary are made in the anterior pituitary. The hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are made in the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis, meaning it produces its own hormones. So posterior pituitary is gonna secrete two hormones that are made in the hypothalamus but stored in the posterior pituitary. And their secretion is activated by neurons activating cells within the posterior pituitary that are coming through this infundibulum. So looking at cell structure, this is a cross section through this structure. Here's the posterior pituitary, here's the anterior pituitary. Now, how can you tell which is which? So here's the anterior pituitary, here's the posterior pituitary. How can you tell which is which? Let me tell you a really easy way. This looks white. This doesn't look so white. You guys, what color is myelin around neurons? What is it made out of?
Isn't it fat?
It's
Fatty?
fat. What color does fat tend to be?
White.
Yellow.
Yellow?
Yeah,
White,
white.
yellow, somewhere in there. When you see that in a cross section or you see a picture, the posterior pituitary is going to look white. It looks like a bunch of axons from neurons. Let me tell you, I only learned that last semester, and while I was at class at Stevenson. That's the way to distinguish them. Is that a lot? Because remember, neurons are coming from the hypothalamus to activate the secretion of hormones in the posterior pituitary. That's where the name comes from. Neurohypophysis. Yeah, I had a professor say, do you want to know how you can easily tell the difference between the two? And I said, how? And she showed me. That's how. You see the glial cells and the nerve fibers. So the two hormones that actually, let me change slides real quick. Okay. Posterior pituitary. Stores antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also called vasopressin. And oxytocin. Remember that these two hormones, are produced in the hypothalamus, but stored in the posterior pituitary. And then there's a nervous system activation of neurons from the hypothalamus that go down into the posterior pituitary and activate the secretion of these. anterior pituitary does a bunch of other hormones, including growth hormone, and or GH. And adrenal corticopic. Or corticotropic hormone is ACTH. And another one is PRL, prolactin releasing hormone. PRL, which is going to activate lactation in the mammary glands, and a few others. There's 6 that come from the anterior pituitary. Here's 3. So coming from the hypothalamus, oxytocin neurosecretory cells in that nucleus, and antidiuretic hormone neurosecretory cells are going to come down and activate the release of ADH and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary is going to release adrenal corticotropic hormone, growth hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. And the hypothalamus, rather than working through the neurons, the hypothalamus is going to activate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary by releasing hormones that act on the anterior pituitary. So hypothalamus releases hormones that act on the anterior pituitary. In contrast, when the hypothalamus activates secretion of hormones from the posterior pituitary, it's working through neurons rather than hormones. So different hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. Can you guess what that maybe does? Let me zoom in on this. What do you think gonadotropin hormone possibly does?
Stimulates the testes and the ovary.
Yeah. And it actually is, so it like gonads. So it's going to activate the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. So these are the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus that are going to activate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Corticotropin releasing hormone is going to work on adrenocorticotropic hormone. Where do you think that works? Maybe on the, go ahead.
Hey,
Claire.
Repeat the question, sorry.
Where do you think the corticotropin releasing hormone acts on the adrenocorticotropic hormone? Where do you think that's, what do you think that activates?
I would say something in your adrenal gland, but
Yeah, you would think so, huh? That's right.
Ah,
So you guys saw, yes, these are long names, but when you break them down and look at different parts, you can figure out where they might be going, right? So rather than make this all about memorization, think about breaking some of them down. So corticotropin release is going to activate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to work on prolactin. Growth hormone releasing hormone, shockingly, is going to work on activating the release of growth hormone. So there is a lot of information here, but sometimes if you break it down, you can figure out what some of these relationships are. Questions? So the other side, the neurohypophysis, or how the hypothalamus acts on the posterior pituitary. Only two hormones are coming from the posterior pituitary. Vasopressin, which is the antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Remember that these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. When the neurons, after we produce the hormone and it's stored in the posterior pituitary, when their release is activated, oxytocin will go on to stimulate the uterus to contract and to stimulate milk letdown. You want the puppy? Do you want to go with mommy? She says, Mary, don't look at me and ask me that kind of question. She says, I don't. Let's see where she goes first. Come here, little minion. Go down. Where are you going to go?
You coming with me? You want to go to bed? Or lie down for a bit?
Well, that was rather Benedict Arnold of her. My mom's going to lay down and we're deciding who she gets to go with. Rather Benedict Arnold of her to immediately go that direction. So vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone, acts on the nephrons in the kidneys to conserve water during urine formation. And it works on arterioles. You guys, what do the arterioles do from earlier today? What do they do?
Well, that says it causes vasoconstriction.
All right, so what do arterioles do, Claire?
So they collect, I don't know, don't they collect water and,
Nope.
or they,
Nope.
not water, they like slow the regulation,
Right.
blood,
Right.
right?
Right. So they're going
Sorry.
to control regulation into different capillary beds. And so vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, can cause vasoconstriction of particular arterioles. So reading this little summary here, 2 clusters of the neurosecretory neuronal cell bodies in the hypothalamus produce either vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, or oxytocin, depending on the neuron. The hormone travels down the axon to be stored in the neuronal terminals of the posterior pituitary. When the neuron is excited, the stored hormone is released from the terminals into the systemic blood for distribution. So follicle stimulating hormone. Remember, this is coming, FSH, coming from the anterior pituitary. Its target organs are the gonads, the ovaries and the testes. In the female, it stimulates the growth of ovarian follicles and secretion of estrogen. In males, it stimulates sperm production. Luteinizing hormone that's also coming from the anterior pituitary also targets the gonads. In females, it stimulates ovulation and maintenance of the corpus luteum, which is going to secrete progesterone. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone secretion. Thyroid stimulating hormone, shockingly, targets the thyroid gland and causes growth of the thyroid and secretion of thyroid hormone. Do me a favor, between now and when we study the endocrine system, which will be in like, I don't know, 2 weeks, maybe less. We'll start it next week in lecture. Make some flashcards of these hormones and start memorizing where they come from, what their target organs are, and what they affect. Because sometimes the endocrine system has the most amount of information for just memorizing. Adrenal corticotropic hormone acts on the adrenal cortex and involves the growth of the adrenal cortex and secretion of glucocorticoids. Remember, glucocorticoids are steroids. Prolactin targets the mammary glands and stimulates milk synthesis. Growth hormones stimulate liver and bone, cartilage, muscle, and fat. Has the most amount of targets. Stimulates widespread tissue growth, especially in the stated tissues. Posterior pituitary secretes antidiuretic hormone that acts on the kidneys to retain water. Oxytocin stimulates the uterus and mammary glands, initiating labor contractions, milk release, possibly involved in ejaculation and sperm transport, sexual affection, and mother-infant bonding, as I can't talk all of a sudden. So prolactin-releasing hormone, bear with me here. Thyrotropin releasing hormone works to activate prolactin releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone acts to stimulate luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone acts on releasing the adrenocorticotropin hormone. Growth hormone acts on the liver, muscle, fat, and so forth. The thyroid gland. This is looking at the anterior surface. So here's your thyroid cartilage right here, right back here. Right below it, as you start talking really funny, right below it, the thyroid gland. On the opposite side, or the posterior view, are the parathyroid glands. Another picture showing this. And recognize when you're, if you didn't see it last week, I'm trying to make your life a little easier when you're doing those questions in Wiley. Come and look at this PowerPoint. It takes me time to do me a favor. It takes me time to modify these figures that I get from your lab exercises. And the whole reason I'm doing it is to make your job easier with filling out those lab exercises. Because what I'm using is I'm putting in their answers for your questions. Did you see that last week? Okay, I'm doing
Yes.
the same. I'm doing the same thing here. This is their picture right here. And all I did was go in there and remove the numbers and add the names. So just to make your life a little easier. So thyroid gland wraps around the anterior, right, just inferior to the thyroid cartilage. The parathyroid glands are on the back posterior surface. Looking at them, here's the parathyroid gland. Here's the thyroid gland with colloid-filled follicles. Parafollicular cells, meaning that they surround the follicle. Para meaning around. Follicular cells that surround the follicle. So parafollicular surround the follicular cells. And the follicular cells surround the follicle, which is going to have the thyroid hormone in it. So the follicle here, the colloid filled follicle, is what's releasing the thyroid hormone. Actually, we're going to watch a mini video clip here. Bear with me. Actually, oh yeah. Let's take a few minutes here. Let's take 5 minutes and come back to right here. So I'm going to come back at 1:21. It's 1:16 right now.
Let me know if you want to go tomorrow.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
You do? Okay, so there's a video here about thyroid hormone function.
So I've got my essay written, and I've been working on it for about a week. Thyroid hormone regulates a variety of physiological and developmental processes, like metabolic rate and neurological, bone, and muscle development.
So thyroid hormone, two different things. It's called T3 or T4, depending on how many iodine residues are bound. They do different functions, but there's both T3 and T4.
Too much leads to increased heart rate, fatigue, and weight loss, just to name a few. Too little leads to facial swelling, weight gain, slow speech, and dry skin, amongst other things. Not enough thyroid hormone during embryogenesis or postnatal development results in intellectual disabilities, impaired motor function, and short stature. Thyroid hormone controls these functions by regulating the expression of genes involved in these processes. This is known as genomic regulation, and it's the topic of this microlist. Thyroid hormone includes triiodothyronine, or just T3, and thyroxine, or just T4. Now, while T3 and T4 differ by only one iodine molecule, their biological activities differ significantly. Of the two hormones, T3 is considered the more biologically active because T4 has a higher binding affinity to plasma proteins, which lowers the concentration of the unbound form, and T4 is immediately converted into T3 as it enters the target cell. And finally, T3 has a significantly higher binding affinity to the thyroid hormone receptor compared to T4, which occurs inside the cell. This means that T3 and T4 must first enter the cell before mediating their effects. Thyroid hormone is taken up by target cells in the same way thyroid hormone is transported out of the thyroid gland, and that's by the monocarboxylate transporter. There are two main types of monocarboxylate transporters involved in thyroid hormone transport. They are type 8 and type 10. Besides differences in tissue expression, little is known about their functional differences. However, animal studies suggest that type 8 plays a more significant role in thyroid hormone transport than type 10. This is consistent with the observation that type 8 deficiency has elevated serum T3 levels and results in neurological developmental delays, while type 10 deficiency is not linked to elevated serum T3 levels or developmental delays. Following uptake, T4 is immediately converted into T3 by deiodinase, which is an enzyme that removes the iodine molecule from the tyrosine ring. There are two classes of iodinases. The 5' 3' deiodinase removes an iodine molecule from the outer tyrosine ring and produces T3. The 5' non' 3' non'.
This is a lot more information than you ever needed. Because we're not gonna worry so much about their conversion, at least not for lab. Like I said, I'm preparing this class as I go. I don't know what your book is going to say with regards to the endocrine system. But right now, yes, let him go through this, but recognize that there's two different forms and that they have different actions.
Non-prime deiodinase removes the iodine molecule from the inner tyrosine ring and produces the biologically inactive RT3. Also, there are two types of 5' 3' deiodinases. The type 1 is found in the thyroid, liver, and kidneys and generates most of the circulating T3, while the type 2 is found in the pituitary, central nervous system, and placenta, and it generates the T3 in those tissues. These differences in expression play an important role in how and when thyroid-stimulating hormone is synthesized and secreted from the anterior pituitary. We'll talk more about that in our microlesson titled Hypothalamic Pituitary Thyroid Axis. Earlier, we said that T3 exerts its effects through genomic regulation. This process starts when thyroid hormone receptor binds T3 to form the thyroid hormone receptor.
Hey, what did it just do? You remember, is this a lipophilic or a hydrophilic hormone?
It's high. Oh, I'm sorry. Lipophilic.
It is, it's lipophilic. So it's going to affect gene expression. Remember, if it's hydrophilic, it's affecting proteins that are already there and affecting their function. Here it's changing what proteins will actually be produced rather than changing the function of pre-existing proteins.
Complex. Together with the retinoid X receptor, they bind the thyroid response elements, which are located within the promoters of target genes. Promoters represent specific DNA sequences that lie upstream of the transcriptional start site. By binding specific proteins like hormone receptor complexes, transcription factors, and cofactors, promoter elements influence the transcription of the downstream gene. Binding the T3 thyroid hormone receptor complex and retinoid X receptor to the thyroid response element of target genes can activate or repress the transcription of genes that regulate basal metabolic rate and development. Thyroid hormone target genes include those that regulate the metabolism of fat, protein, and carbohydrates. For example, thyroid hormone upregulates the expression of enzymes involved in gluconeogenesis and enzymes that
You guys, what do you think gluconeogenesis means? What does genesis mean?
New, forming, new,
Right?
no,
What do you,
growing.
what,
Creating, yeah.
yep. What do you think gluco means?
Sugar.
Yep.
Yeah.
So producing new sugar. Neo means new.
Hi, Papa.
increase the supply of substrates for gluconeogenesis, like amino acids and glycerol. It increases amino acid levels by regulating proteases that break down proteins, and glycerol levels by upregulating lipases that cleave the glycerol from triglycerides. In addition, thyroid hormone-dependent increases in metabolism of fat, protein, and carbohydrates are parallel in the upregulation of genes involved in increased oxygen consumption and cell activity. Besides regulating metabolic rate, thyroid hormone also plays a role in neurological, skeletal, and muscle development during embryogenesis and postnatal development. For example, thyroid hormone influences neurological development by regulating the expression of genes involved in myelination, neuron differentiation, migration, and signaling. It also influences skeletal development by regulating the expression of genes involved in the rate of bone maturation and linear growth, matrix degradation, bone formation and remodeling, matrix production, cell differentiation, and clonal expansion. Thyroid hormone also regulates muscle development during embryogenesis and postnatal development by regulating the expression of genes involved.
What does embryogenesis mean?
Growing baby.
Yep.
Or
Yeah, creation of egg or a baby.
Yep.
In the fusion of myoblasts, the formation of new fibers, and the fusion of new myoblasts to existing fibers. In conclusion, knowing how the thyroid hormone is transported into target cells, how it's converted to the active form, and how it binds the.
Okay, that's the end of that. Or um, So parathyroid gland works to maintain blood calcium homeostasis, keeping blood calcium levels within narrow limits. Zena, I know you're here. Here's your answer for one of your case study questions that's coming up.
Okay.
If the calcium levels rise above a certain level, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin. Calcitonin results in calcium being taken up by the bone. And then that brings the blood calcium levels down. When the blood calcium levels fall too low, and we're in this never-ending one way or the other balance. If the blood calcium levels fall too low, the parathyroid glands are going to release parathyroid hormone, which is going to cause bone to be broken down in order to elevate blood calcium levels. So I think that I think, Zena, that's going to answer two of your questions on that case study, if I remember right.
Okay.
We'll see.
What did you say will cause the bone to break down?
Parathyroid hormone.
Got you.
We'll see it again, but it's a different diagram than what you'll see when we're talking about bones in 121. But it's the same pathway. So hypothalamus and the thyroid hormone. Hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, which activates the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland stimulates production of T3 and T4, triiodine thyro something or other hormone, and thyroxine, results in increased metabolism, increased growth and development, and increased catecholamine, increasing the temperature also, temperature regulation. Once you've got enough metabolism, enough growth and development, and the T3 will actually come back and negatively impact through a negative feedback loop, stop the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone. I think one of your questions asks you about negative feedback loops. Most often, hormones are working through negative feedback loops. We know there's exceptions. Oxytocin works through positive feedback loops, right? Through child labor, or not child labor, labor and delivery. Thyroid hormone temperature regulation. Hotter temperatures cause the hypothalamus to inhibit thyroxine release. Remember, that's T4 from the thyroid, which decreases the metabolic rate of the body and reduces heat production. Colder temperatures cause the hypothalamus to stimulate thyroxine release. Guys, this is what one of your virtual labs is about, which increases the metabolic rate of the body and in order to generate heat, raising the body temp. Questions about the thyroid hormone? So pancreas produces three major hormones, two of which we'll talk about more than the third one. Alpha cells secrete glucagon. Beta cells secrete insulin. There's another type of cell, a delta cell, that stimulates what's called somatostatin. But right now, keep in mind glucagon and insulin. These are found within the pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, beta cells secrete insulin. Pancreatic islets have the tail of the pancreas, the body of the pancreas, and the head of the pancreas. You have pancreatic ducts, which are secreting the hormones into the duodenal-pancreatic duct. I think that's what this is called right here. No, that's not right. Duodenal-gastric duct, something to that effect. Right here. Now, I got one more video. I think sometimes these videos are better at explaining things. So I like videos sometimes, and it breaks it up. Well, why did I do that? That wasn't supposed to happen. Go back. No, I didn't want the virtual lab. I clicked on the wrong thing. I'm like, what? Why is it taking me into McGraw-Hill? Okay.
Hi guys, this is Mrs. Boy, and this is a screencast on the endocrine system to talk about how blood glucose is regulated. So this is blood sugar, your blood sugar. And there's actually two hormones that have to do with how your blood sugar is regulated, insulin and glucagon. Both of these are hormones, and they are actually produced in the pancreas. And this is where the pancreas sits, kind of behind the stomach. And we'll talk more about the pancreas in just a minute. So the first thing we need to get straight is the difference between glucose and glycogen. Glucose is a monosaccharide. So this is C6H12O6, right? Glucose. This is the fuel that we use for making ATPs and cellular respiration. And glycogen is a polysaccharide. So this is going to be a chain of glucose molecules.
Where do you store glycogen? Do you remember? This was a long time ago, but where do you store it?
In your cells, like your muscle cells.
Muscle cells, and where else?
Is it in like, I want to say like the gallbladder, but that's wrong.
You're really, really close though. Where else?
The liver?
Yeah, in the liver. In the liver. So the muscle in the liver. More specifically, the liver is willing to give up glucose to other organs. Muscle will store glycogen, but it doesn't give it up to other tissues. It only uses it for its own purposes. It's kind of stingy like that.
A chain of glucose molecules that is an animal starch. So you can see there's glucose, 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 all bonded together to form this big molecule called glycogen. Unfortunately, glycogen sounds a lot like the hormone glucagon. So you got to keep all your G's separated, okay? So glucose, glycogen, glucose is a sugar, glycogen is a starch, a polysaccharide. So there are two hormones that
They have opposing effects, insulin and glucagon. Insulin is going to work to bring down blood glucose. Glucagon is going to work to bring it up.
keep blood glucose in homeostasis. One is insulin and one is glucagon. I'm really, really sorry, but that sounds kind of like glycogen. Don't forget that glucose is the sugar and glycogen is the starch. Okay, so don't get these confused with hormones, which are chemical messengers in the blood, insulin and glucagon. And as you can see, these two hormones work antagonistic to each other. So just like in your literature, antagonists work against each other, so does insulin and glucagon. So insulin is going to decrease the blood glucose level, and glucagon acts to increase the blood glucose level. So these two hormones are going to work in homeostasis to keep that blood glucose level balanced. So we're going to look at insulin first. And what we see is that glucose, the molecule, is really too big to just diffuse into a cell. And remember, this is where that glucose is going to be burned. Glucose is going to be burned as a fuel. And this is actually not a cell wall, this is cell membrane. So just make sure we got that straight. So we use glucose as a fuel. But glucose cannot just get into the cell. It actually needs insulin as the key. And insulin is the hormone that is going to allow glucose to get into the cell. Without insulin, glucose would just build up in the blood, and you would have higher and higher level.
Without insulin, glucose keeps rising. What is that? What disease is that?
Hypoglycemic.
No, you're the opposite. But you know what?
Hyper, sorry.
It will cause hypoglycemia,
Diabetes.
diabetes. Two different ways. Insulin, either you are resistant to it, meaning your body keeps creating insulin, but your cells aren't responding to it. That's type 2 diabetes, or it's an autoimmune disorder that you're losing your beta cells that are creating insulin.
Of glucose in your blood. So we can see what happens is that when glucose is in the bloodstream, insulin is also released into the bloodstream, and insulin is going to bind to the cell. So here's the cell, and it's going to act like a key to allow glucose to get in, and then it's going to be used to burn energy. Or excuse me, it's going to be used as a fuel to be able to make some ATPs. So here's the basics of how these two hormones work. So first of all, let's talk about insulin. Insulin is released by, oh, this is wrong, guys. Sorry, these are beta cells. Insulin is released by beta cells in the pancreas, and they act on body cells to.
So this one is wrong too. It's insulin that's going to be released by beta cells, which is going to work to decrease blood glucose levels. Here, glucose, I like the way she's explaining it, but understand that she's got some typos in here. Here, insulin is going to be released. Actually, no, she has it right, except for the beta cells. So glucagon's released from alpha cells in the pancreas that acts on the liver to increase blood glucose levels. Here, insulin is released by beta cells to act on body cells to absorb glucose, decreasing blood glucose levels.
Be able to absorb glucose, thus decreasing the blood glucose level. And glucagon, is released by alpha cells alpha cells in the pancreas, and they mostly, glucagon, this hormone acts on the liver. And what it does is it stimulates the liver to take glycogen, which is the starch, and break it down into glucose, which increases the blood glucose level. So let's take a further look then at the pancreas. So let's take a look at what happens when we have a high blood sugar level. So this would be the stimulus. We have a high blood sugar level. And what that does is that is going to stimulate the pancreas, which releases the hormone insulin into the bloodstream. And what that does is that is going to act on two different major body parts. It's going to act on the muscles in our body, and it is going to say, okay, we've got plenty of sugar, so you can start to store some of that sugar as glycogen. It also tells the liver the same thing, and it also is going to tell regular body cells that they can, this is body cells, that they can absorb glucose and use it to make some ATPs. And so as that happens, we can see that the outcome of that is that the blood sugar would be reduced. In the opposite situation, if we have low blood sugar, that stimulates the pancreas to release the other glucose hormone called glucagon. Glucagon majorly acts on the liver, and it tells the liver to take some glycogen, which is our starch, and to break that down into glucose. And the glucose is then released in the bloodstream. There is actually another hormone that's produced by the adrenal gland, which sits on top of our kidney. And that releases another hormone called adrenaline, which is our fight or flight. And that basically does, that gives the same signal to the liver to release a flood of sugar. And so this is going to increase our blood sugar, and so it acts in an opposite way. So here is a look at the pancreas itself. So you can see here's the pancreas, and the pancreas actually acts as an exocrine gland. It acts as an exocrine gland, and it also acts as an endocrine gland. We'll learn more about this in class. So as an exocrine gland, it is releasing digestive enzymes, and also it's going to release some
Exocrine is going to release onto the surface. Endocrine are going to release into the blood. So exocrine releases onto the surface of a structure. Endocrine releases into the blood.
Some more neutralizing solution to neutralize what's coming out from the acid. And so these digestive enzymes and juices are released.
So right here, alpha cells secrete glucagon, beta cells secrete insulin, and exocrine acinar cells are secreting digestive enzymes.
Released into the duodenum. But it also has an endocrine function. It has a hormone function. So there are these little pockets of cells called the islets of Langerhans, or pancreatic islets. And inside each of these, you will see some alpha cells.
Did you guys hear what she called them? Islets? Did you hear what I called them earlier?
Islets?
Islets. So
Yeah.
that's another reason we don't make fun of people's pronunciation. Because my guess is she's a professor. Listening to her talk, am I going to argue with how she pronounces it?
Nope.
No.
Cells and some beta cells. The beta cells produce the insulin, Beta cells produce the insulin, and the alpha cells produce the glucagon, And so these two hormones then are released from these little islets into the bloodstream, and then they go and act on either the liver or the body cells. So here's the big picture of how these two hormones act for homeostasis, all right? So let's say that we have an increase, let's say we have an increase, right, purple. Let's say we have an increase in our blood glucose. So what that does is that is going to stimulate the beta cells of the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin is going to flood into our bloodstream, and it is going to tell our body cells to absorb glucose. It is also going to act on the liver, and it's going to say, hey, we have plenty of blood glucose, so go ahead and take up some glucose and store it as glycogen. And so the result of that is that the blood glucose level falls. Notice that the reaction is opposite. The reaction is opposite to the stimulus. So this is a negative feedback loop. Now, let's take a look at what happens when, I'm going to write in pink. So let's say what happens when blood glucose levels rise. So what happens when blood glucose levels start to rise is that we are going to, I'm so sorry. So then they would rise again. I'm sorry, we're starting on this side. Sorry, right here. So the stimulus is decreased blood glucose levels. So the decrease in blood glucose levels then is going to act on the pancreas. And this time it's going to be the alpha cells in the pancreas that are going to release glucagon. Glucagon is the other hormone. And that is going to stimulate maybe the liver, majority of the liver, to say, we need some more glucose, hurry up and release some. So it's going to take glycogen, and glycogen, remember, is a starch made up of glucose subunits, and it's going to break that down, and glucose is going to be released into the blood. And so the reaction then is blood glucose levels rise. And so I have the opposite reaction here. My stimulus was low blood glucose, and my response is high blood glucose. And so this is another example of a negative feedback. But you can see these two hormones work antagonistically to keep the blood glucose level in homeostasis. So what actually happens in the cell itself is a signal transduction pathway. So remember, glucose itself is too big to just diffuse into the cell. So here's the inside of the cell right here. And so insulin is going to act as a ligand, and it is going to
It's binding to a receptor. Insulin's binding to a receptor on the surface of the plasma membrane. Therefore, what kind of hormone is it? Is it lipophilic or is it hydrophilic? Binding to a receptor on the surface of the cell, is it lipophilic or hydrophilic?
Are you talking specifically about glucose?
I'm talking about insulin.
Insulin? Okay.
Sorry, insulin. What is it?
Can you repeat the question again for us, please?
If insulin is binding to a receptor on the plasma membrane, is it a hydrophilic or lipophilic hormone?
Or lipid, and I see like fatty, is that fatty acid over there?
Wait. If it's binding on the membrane of the
Okay.
cell, is it binding, is it a hydrophilic or a lipophilic hormone?
Oh, it would be hydrophilic.
It's hydrophilic. You're right, it's gonna work on fatty acids ultimately, but it's doing a second messenger activation as it performs all these other processes. It's not changing gene expression.
Bond with an insulin receptor when it is stimulated, when the blood glucose level is high. And what happens then is that sends off a signal transduction pathway in the cell, a signal transduction pathway in the cell. And what happens is that turns on the glucose transporter in the cell membrane. And so glucose starts to come in from the blood. And so what happens is a couple of different things can happen. First of all, this glucose could be actually burned to produce some pyruvate, and we're going to get some ATP, that's cellular respiration. Or some of the glucose could be stored temporarily as glycogen. Or some of that glucose could be actually stored more long-term in fatty acids. So hopefully that's been helpful, and that's the story of how.
Okay. We may rewatch these when we go through these in lecture. Let me just think about it, because they're pretty good at explaining the functions of these two. Is that your baby, Becky?
Yes, I just took him to the vet. He is almost 40 pounds at 16 weeks.
A little baby Tyrannosaurus.
He is. He's being good. He chewed part of my notebook here just a second ago, so
Well,
I had to
maybe you
discipline him.
You shouldn't have left it where he could find it.
I know, heaven forbid, on my lap during class.
Darn it. Well,
Bodhi,
you know
no.
what? It really is your own fault.
It is. Bodhi.
So actions of insulin and glucagon. Insulin is going to work to lower the blood glucose levels by causing the absorption of glucose into the cells. It's going to stimulate glycogenesis. What's glycogenesis? What's glycogenesis?
I'd answer, but my dog's barking. Sorry.
Is that the production of now mine hear it. Production of glycose.
You're close. It's not glucose. What else could it be?
Insulin.
Oh, it's not insulin. You guys, what other thing did she talk about? When you're connecting a bunch of
Glucagon.
you're close. What's the polysaccharide of glucose?
Glucogen.
Glycogen, yes. So insulin is going to stimulate the production, the uptake of glucose, and stimulate its polymerization into glycogen or glycogenesis. Glucagon is going to work to elevate blood glucose levels. And it's going to do it through producing glucose, gluconeogenesis, or glycogenolysis. What is glycogenolysis?
Is it the breakdown of
Of
glycogen?
what?
Of glycogen into glucose?
It is. Good job. So this is another, almost what she showed. I'm not going to go through it for you, but showing how it's regulating blood glucose levels. How insulin and glucagon are working to regulate blood glucose levels. So insulin facilitates glucose transport into cells, stimulates glycogenesis in skeletal muscle and liver, inhibits glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen, inhibits gluconeogenesis, producing new glucose. If you're trying to get the glucose level down, you don't want to produce more. And it's going to inhibit also lipolysis. Without reading this, what does lipolysis mean?
Production of fat,
No,
Oh,
it's a
protein.
the reduction of fat
Oh,
or breaks up fat. Lysis is breakup.
yes. The breakdown of fat. Yes.
so as women, we all want the lipolysis or
But
whatever.
you know they accepted that Jesus is their savior and that's why they live for forever. That's terrible. All right, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be sharing that in class. That's a Facebook quote that's terrible. You guys, that was very, I apologize. Well, I'm actually a fairly religious person. I shouldn't be saying that kind of stuff. So we won't say that anymore. Oh, that is terrible. Okay.
Good thing your mom's taking a nap.
I know. Tell me about it. Oh, tell me about it. Get me all in trouble. She'd probably just say, Mary, really? All right. Okay. Different parts of the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. So here we are, we're looking at the adrenal glands that are right above the kidneys. The capsule, and then the cortex has three basic layers. The zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, the zona reticularis, and then the adrenal medulla. Work to memorize those layers in order. Grandma fast for Ryan. Zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. That's terrible. You know what? It might work. All right. Those are the three layers of the cortex. And the adrenal medulla. So adrenal cortex is going to produce aldosterone, which is going to work on the kidneys for water retention and potassium excretion. Helps maintain blood pressure and blood volume in combination with the antidiuretic hormone that was released from the posterior pituitary. The cortisol, or corticosteroid, affects most tissues, stimulates fat and protein catabolism, gluconeogenesis, and stress resistance and tissue repair. Dehydroepiandrosterone target organs, bone, muscle, integument, brain, and many other tissues. It's a precursor for producing testosterone. and indirectly promotes the growth of bones, pubic and axillary hair, apocrine glands, and fetal male reproductive tract, and stimulates libido. Pancreatic islets, glucagon, remember that's coming from the alpha cells, stimulates predominantly the liver to stimulate amino acid absorption, gluconeogenesis, glycogen, and fat breakdown, and raise blood glucose and fatty acid levels. Insulin affects most of many tissues, stimulates glucose and amino acid uptake, lowers blood glucose levels, and promotes glycogen, fat, and protein synthesis to bring down blood glucose levels. Somatostatin, remember that's coming from what were called the delta cells. Targets the stomach, the intestines, and the pancreatic islet cells. Modulates digestion, nutrient absorption, and glucagon and insulin secretion. Gastrin, this is what's coming from those exocrine acinar cells of the pancreas. Targets the stomach and stimulates stomach acid secretion and gastric motility. Pineal gland works on stimulating the melatonin, which is going to affect your sleep-wake cycles. Hormones from the pineal gland, thymus, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, and adrenal medulla. Pineal gland, melatonin. Target is the brain. Its principal effects a little uncertain, but may influence mood and sexual maturation and your sleep-wake cycles. Thymus. Hormones. Thyrosin. Oh wait, no, bear with me. Thymus, thymopoietin, thymosin, and thymulin. Target organs, T cells. Stimulates T lymphocyte development and activity, so immune system. Thyroid gland, thyroxine, and triiodothyronine. Most tissues are the target organs. Elevates metabolic rate, heat production, increases respiratory rate, heart rate, and strength of heartbeat, contractility. Remember, that was one of those that came up this morning, that thyroid hormone activates contractility. Stimulates appetite, accelerates breakdown of nutrients, and promotes alertness and quickened reflexes. Stimulates the breakdown of nutrients and promotes alertness. Stimulates growth hormone secretion, growth of skin, nails, hair, teeth, and fetal nervous system. Calcitonin affects the bone and stimulates bone deposition, especially in children. Parathyroid glands. Major target organs, bone, kidneys, and small intestines. Raises blood calcium levels by stimulating bone resorption. Remember, that's breakdown, bone breakdown. And inhibiting the deposition, meaning the building up of bone. And reducing urinary calcium excretion and enhancing calcitriol synthesis. Adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine, norepinephrine, and and dopamine. Those are hormones, but if you look at them, they're also neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters can be hormones depending on what they're doing and what they're affecting. Target organs, most tissues. Promotes alertness, metabolizes organic fuels, raises metabolic rate, stimulates circulation and respiration, increases blood glucose levels, inhibits insulin secretion and glucose uptake by insulin-dependent organs. Questions? Ovaries and testes. Ovaries secrete estrogen, and you don't see it on here, but progesterone. Testes are going to secrete testosterone. So ovary hormones from ovaries and testes. Ovaries are going to secrete estradiol, which is also estrogen. Target organs, many tissues. Stimulates female reproductive development and adolescent growth. Regulates the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. Prepares mammary glands for lactation. Progesterone, specifically targeting targets the uterus and mammary glands, regulates the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, and prepares mammary glands for lactation. Inhibin targets the anterior pituitary and inhibits follicle stimulating secretion. This is your negative feedback loop. Estrogen is also what makes you so tired during your period sometimes, as your estrogen levels are drop. Testosterone affects many tissues, stimulates fetal and adolescent reproductive development, musculoskeletal growth, sperm production, and libido. Testes also, like the ovaries, produce inhibin, which impacts the anterior pituitary and by which inhibits follicle stimulating hormone. Major ways that hormones are regulated. Hormones are regulated by hormone secretion by other glands. So some hormones, just like you saw up here, inhibin is going to inhibit the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. Or they can stimulate and maintain their endocrine target tissues. The release of a hormone positively enforces the tissue maintenance of the tissue that released that hormone. Humoral blood levels, blood calcium levels. Nervous system, adrenaline from the adrenal gland, medulla, that's secreted in response to the sympathetic nervous system. So 3 different ways: hormonally, humorally, meaning blood levels, and the nervous system. Negative feedback loops. Increased levels of triiodone thyroxine and thyroxine are both going to inhibit levels of thyroid stimulating hormone. When there's too much of it, you want it initially. You up the amounts of thyroid stimulating hormone in the hypothalamus, triggers more thyroid releasing hormone, then you goes down and thyroid releasing hormone activates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which then acts on the thyroid to increase the amount of triiodone thyroxine and thyroxine. And then once the levels of triiodone, thyroxine, and thyroxine are up high, the high levels will come back and negatively block the levels of thyroid releasing hormone. So this is a negative feedback. Guys, do you have any questions for me?
No, but that was a lot today.
It is a lot. Tell me about it.
I mean, you're teaching it, so.
It is a lot. And that's why I'm saying make some flashcards. Because it's not so much comprehension as understanding the pathways. Positive feedback loop. Baby sucks on nipple. The sucking sends impulses to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus sends signals to the posterior pituitary telling it to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is released and stimulates milk ejection from the mammary gland. Milk is released and baby continues to feed. Positive feedback. Another form of positive and negative feedback. Positive feedback. During the menstrual cycle before ovulation, small amounts of estrogen are secreted from the ovaries. The estrogen stimulates the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. The gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. The luteinizing hormone is going to cause the release of additional estrogen from the ovary, which is then going to re-stimulate gonadotropin releasing hormone release from the hypothalamus. Negative feedback loop. During the menstrual cycle, after ovulation, the ovary begins to secrete progesterone in response to the luteinizing hormone that came from the anterior pituitary. The progesterone inhibits the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. The decreased gonadotropin releasing hormone, the decreased gonadotropin releasing hormone in response to the increased levels of progesterone reduces the amount of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. And the gonadotropin and luteinizing hormone levels drop. Now, question, what would you expect the concentration of thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, to be normal, above normal, or below normal in a person whose diet is deficient in iodine? Thyroid stimulating hormone coming from the pituitary.
I'm gonna say below normal.
Why?
Well, if you don't, oh, shush up. Because you're deficient in iodine and you need it to synthesize, I'm sorry, I have a headache. Synthesize, you need it to take care of the thyroid hormone. So I just feel like it would just be lower.
What if I tell you that thyroid hormones work as a negative feedback loop and you can only make thyroid hormones if you have iodine?
Wait, you said that you need iodine to create that.
Yep, you need iodine to create the thyroid hormones. And the only way for you to inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone secretion is by having enough thyroid hormones.
Mm.
I'm confused about that. Isn't
Yeah,
hypo
and I have a headache, so I'm so confused.
isn't hypothyroidism then the low iodine? Wait.
Hypothyroid.
Oh no, I have it mixed up in my head. Yeah,
Yeah,
isn't low iodine, or is that hyperthyroidism then? If that's
you're gonna actually have, if you are low on iodine, that's when people develop goiters because their thyroid hormone
yes.
is trying to produce enough, that it's trying to overcompensate for the fact that you have an iodine deficiency. If you can't stop the thyroid stimulating hormone by producing enough thyroid hormones, if you don't produce enough thyroid hormone,
Mhm.
you're going to keep producing thyroid stimulating hormone until your pituitary burns out. If it does burn out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can't block the only way for you to stop producing thyroid stimulating hormone is to get enough thyroid hormone in your blood that it stops the secretion.
Okay, that makes sense now. Okay.
Becky,
Yes.
does that work? And I understand having a headache. Okay, patient displays symptoms of excess cortisol secretion coming from the adrenal cortex. What factors could be measured in a blood sample to determine whether the condition is caused by a defect at the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary level or the adrenal cortex level?
T3, T4.
Not T3 and T4. They're not involved here.
In here? Oh. And they test for the CRH, I guess. Is that what that
What
says?
would that tell them? If the person is deficient in CRH, what does that tell them?
That it's
That's
coming-
corticotropin releasing hormone.
It's coming from the hypothalamus and not the
That's where the problems are. They're
Right.
producing too much corticotropin releasing hormone.
yes. Oh, yes.
Yes, yeah. I'm gonna ask you these same questions when we finish the endocrine system in lecture, because we'll go through a lot of this again. Adrenal corticotropic thyroid hormone. How would you determine that it's coming from the anterior pituitary level? Where maybe what if you have a tumor of the pituitary gland? And it's just secreting too much of this. And that's why you're creating excessive levels of this. Because no matter how much cortisol you produce, you can't turn off this. Does that make sense?
When you say it that way, it makes more sense. Yeah.
Last part of this, talking about adaptation syndrome. Adapting to stress levels. So short-term stress response, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases. You see that bear in front of you, what are you gonna do? Heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, bronchioles dilate to give you more air. Liver is gonna convert glycogen to glucose so you can run away from the bear and hopefully be faster than your friend. And release the glucose to the blood. Blood flow changes, reducing digestive system activity. We don't want to be metabolizing things right now. We want to be able to run. You're going to reduce urine output. Long-term stress response. Kidneys retain sodium and water. Blood volume and blood pressure rise. Immune system is suppressed. This is why people who are under a lot of stress get sick. Proteins, fats converted to glucose are broken down for energy and blood glucose increases. Questions? That's the end. I want to spend, you sure there's no questions?
No, I don't have any.
No, I'm gonna have to listen to this maybe 2 more times.
Well, yeah, but right now I'm good.
It's a lot of information, and I know that.
It is, and it's a lot of I feel like some of the words seem so similar, but yet so different.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you just need to review and stuff. And we are going to go over it in lecture, so that'll help.
let's, I want to just spend the last 8 minutes going over some more of the blood vessels and make a little bit more headway with that. And then we'll be done for this week.
Sounds good.
Okay. So you guys realize that once we finish blood vessels, which we will finish next Friday, your first exam is going to be posted. It won't be included in your midterm grades because you're not going to set the deadline that close, because spring break is right after that. And during that time, I need to get your midterm grades done.
So, we'll be taking the midterm over spring break.
Yes, but you'll have until like that next Thursday after spring break.
Okay.
You don't have to take it all. I'm not going to make you do homework or take your exams during the school semester, not during spring break. I wouldn't mind doing that to you, but Hack won't let me do it to you. So you can thank them for not making you do that kind of stuff. That's terrible, but we won't say anything. So arterial sense organs. These are receptors found in the walls of major organs. We have chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. They're going to be involved in regulating blood pressure. If the heart rate needs to go up because your cardiac output is too low, this is where the signal is going to be, this is where it's going to be sensed that your blood pressure is too low. Therefore, we need to increase your heart rate. Chemoreceptors. What about the oxygen levels and the pH? So carotid body up in the internal carotid arteries contain chemoreceptors. Carotid sinus, right, that bifurcation of the external and internal carotid arteries, contain baroreceptors. Remember, baroreceptors are for pressure, like a barometer, measuring pressures. Aortic bodies are found in the aortic arch that have chemoreceptors, and baroreceptors are also found in the aortic arch and in the right atrium. So these are going to transmit information to the brainstem to regulate heartbeat. Remember that that cardio-acceleratory and cardio-inhibitory centers that regulate parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system effects on heartbeat and contractions. So going to transmit information to the brainstem to regulate heartbeat, blood vessel diameters, and respiration. Muscular arteries are distributing arteries. Muscular arteries are distal to elastic arteries, and they deliver blood to body organs. This would be an example would be your radial artery, your ulnar artery, your popliteal artery. have a thicker tunica media. Remember, tunica media is what contains the smooth muscle and less elastic tissue than elastic arteries. And are active, these are also active in vasoconstriction. Arterioles are, you can consider them your smallest arteries. They lead into capillary beds. They control the flow into capillary beds via vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So these are the policemen that are going to decide where, if the blood goes into a particular capillary bed or not. Arterioles are your major resistance vessels, and we're going to use resistance to block whether blood flows into a vessel or not. The radius of supplying given organs, the rate or arterial radii supplying given organs can be adjusted independently in order to distribute cardiac output amongst different organs. So this, you have that 5 liters of blood. Well, which organ gets blood at what given time and under what circumstance? This is controlled by the arterioles. If I'm sitting here right here, I'm not on my exercising. So I probably need more going to my mouth, more blood going to my mouth, more blood going to my lungs, hopefully more blood going to my head, so I think, than blood going to my legs because I'm not exercising or lifting weights. Arterioles also help regulate arterial blood pressure. And you guys, I think that is a great place to stop. I will see you next week and we'll start right here.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Welcome.
Have a good weekend, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, you too.